On a cold morning in May of 1945, days after Germany officially surrendered, an exhausted German U-boat slowly surfaced off the coast of Newfoundland. It raised no battle flag. Its crew stood silently on deck, and its captain, a man known for discipline, precision, and absolute loyalty, stepped forward and made a request that stunned the American sailors watching him through binoculars. He wished to surrender immediately. Nothing unusual yet, except for one detail that would later shock Allied intelligence. The U-boat captain insisted he had encountered something impossible in the North Atlantic, something that made him abandon his mission, something he refused to describe over radio, something he said he would explain only face-to-face, and only to the Americans. This is the story the German Navy tried to bury, and the one the U.S. Navy never fully explained. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten wartime mystery, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next historical stories we uncover. Now let's begin with the final hours of U-boat UEXXX and the message that confused both Berlin and Washington. 1. The unfinished war voyage in early 1945. The Kriegsmarine still operated dozens of U-boats despite collapsing fronts, fuel shortages, and Allied air supremacy. Many were sent on one-way patrols, desperate final attempts to harass Allied shipping. One such submarine departed Norway under strict radio silence. Its captain, Oberleutnant Karl Neumann, name often changed in records, was known for calm nerves and professionalism. His crew trusted him blindly. Their orders were simple: cross the North Atlantic, attack East Coast convoys, avoid capture at all costs. None of them expected the war to end before they returned. But only halfway through their mission, the situation changed. Berlin fell. Hitler died. The German Navy began receiving scattered surrender instructions. USSX, still deep in the Atlantic, waited for confirmation. That confirmation never arrived. Instead, something far stranger happened. 2. The radio message that made no sense on May 8th, Allied listening stations intercepted a short, broken German transmission. It came from USX. Observed phenomenon, request instructions, unknown contact, cannot engage. The message was repeated twice, then cut off abruptly. No coordinates, no identification, no explanation. Allied signal analysts were confused. German U-boats did not ask permission to not engage targets. They did not report phenomena, and they did not request orders after the war was already over. American intelligence feared it might be a coded distress signal. But then the second transmission arrived. We are surfacing. We are surrendering. That was it. No mention of combat, no mechanical failure, no damage. Just a sudden surrender in the middle of nowhere. The U.S. Navy dispatched a destroyer escort to intercept the submarine. What they found was even stranger. 3. The unexpected condition of the U-boat when the American destroyer reached UX. Several things immediately stood out. The U-boat was undamaged. Its torpedoes were still aboard. Its fuel tanks were nearly full. The crew appeared shaken, not defeated. The captain avoided questions. It didn't fit any pattern of a typical surrendering vessel. According to declassified Navy notes, the captain approached the boarding officer and said quietly, "I must report what we saw, but only to your commanders." When asked what he meant, he simply replied, "It was not a ship, and it was not ours." Witnesses later recalled that several crewmen refused to step back inside the submarine, insisting they would rather be taken prisoner on the open deck. Whatever they had seen, it had terrified hardened sailors who had spent years fighting in the deadliest waters on Earth. 4. What the crew claimed happened in the fog during interrogation. Fragments of the crew's stories slowly emerged. 3 consistent details were repeated. A thick, unnatural fog appeared suddenly at night. A silent object moved around the U-boat, circling it without making waves. Their instruments malfunctioned, including magnetic compasses and hydrophones. Some described the object as a dark mass. Others said it emitted a faint glow. One sailor claimed it rose vertically out of the water, as if gravity did not apply. The captain refused to confirm these details, but he did not deny them either. Instead, he said, "I made the decision that continuing the mission was impossible." American intelligence wanted specifics. Was it an Allied experimental submarine? A British decoy vessel? A new type of radar illusion? Mass hysteria? But every technical explanation clashed with the crew's accounts. Whatever they saw in the fog was not shaped like a ship or submarine. It moved without sound. It left no wake. And the pressure wave from its movement was wrong, according to the U-boat's hydrophone opera.
And, according to declassified British files, German sailors had reported similar sightings earlier in the war, but their commanders dismissed them. 5. The Americans' conclusion, and the parts they classified after days of interrogation, the U.S. Navy officially recorded the surrender as ordinary. UXXX surrendered without engagement. Crew cooperative, vessel intact, but another report, stamped classify, referenced navigation blackout, anomalous radar echoes, hydrophone distortion, crew psychological trauma. A known maritime contact. This second report was kept hidden for decades. When finally released, several lines were censored. One sentence, partially visible, reads, "The captain acted with sound judgment given the nature of the encounter." What kind of encounter could justify abandoning a wartime mission? The Navy never answered, and the captain never told the full story. At least not publicly. The interrogations began immediately after the surrender, and they did not go the way the American officers expected. They had prepared for technical explanations, mechanical failures, or a simple confession that the captain no longer wanted to risk his men in the final days of the war. Instead, every conversation pushed the investigation into stranger territory. Several crew members described the same sound inside the submarine during the final hours before surrender. They said it was like metal bending slowly, then shifting from one side of the hull to the other. They compared it to a vibration or a deep mechanical breathing. None of them could identify a source. It did not match the signature of a ship, a whale, a depth charge, or underwater machinery. It was something entirely unfamiliar. One sailor said quietly, "If it had been an enemy ship, we would have heard propellers. If it had been an animal, we would have felt pressure waves." This was different, completely different. The Americans first assumed fatigue, stress, or lack of oxygen had created hallucinations, but the psychologist assigned to the interrogation team insisted that the crew did not behave like men who imagined things. They behaved like men who had witnessed something real, something they were struggling to understand, and something that genuinely frightened them. When investigators reviewed the captain's personal diary, the mystery only deepened. Official German logs were short and technical, but his private notes revealed emotional strain and rising fear. He wrote about a strange fog that appeared suddenly surrounding the submarine on all sides. He wrote that every depth gauge began malfunctioning at the same time. He wrote that he heard footsteps on the hull, as if something was moving along the outside of the submarine. The final entry before he ordered the surrender was chilling. It described a faint light in the water, not a reflection, not a searchlight, but its own soft, steady glow. He wrote that it moved slowly through the fog, too smoothly to be a man-made craft, too controlled to be a natural phenomenon. The entry ends with 5 words: "This is not a ship." American naval intelligence knew that German captains were trained to the highest standards. They were expected to maintain radio silence, avoid capture, and destroy their submarine rather than surrender it. Breaking even one of these rules was unthinkable. Captain Newman broke all of them. When asked why he surrendered, he never offered a clear explanation, but at one point, in a moment not included in the final declassified report, he said, "The war ended for me the moment I understood we were not alone in the ocean." He refused to elaborate. American analysts considered whether the crew had encountered a secret Allied prototype, something classified even within the Navy, but the records showed no such vessel in the area. British and American engineers were experimenting with early stealth coatings and quiet propulsion systems, but none of them were capable of the near-silent movement the Germans described. No craft of the time could move without propeller noise, without wake, and without any measurable pressure wave. Magnetic anomalies created further confusion. The submarine's compass had spun wildly moments before the encounter. The magnetic field around the U-boat had fluctuated so strongly that the needle reversed direction more than once. Magnetometers on shore recorded no regional disturbances. That meant the anomaly was hyperlocal. Only something with a powerful electromagnetic field, or a phenomenon not yet understood, could have caused such an effect. The radio operator's testimony was equally unsettling. He said that before the strange object appeared, he began picking up an interference pattern unlike anything he had heard. It wasn't Morse code, wasn't static, wasn't atmospheric noise. It pulsed like a biological rhythm, but no sea creature could generate such frequencies. Experts who later examined the recording classified the signal as unidentified. What disturbed investigators most was that every technical failure and every sensory anomaly occurred at the same time. The fog, the magnetic disruption, the vibrations on the hull, the interference on the radio, and the sudden appearance of an unknown light in the water. To this day, no official report has offered a satisfying explanation. American analysts wrote that the contact does not match any known allied German or civilian vessel. The statement was printed in red ink. Privately, several observers admitted the same thought. Whatever the U-boat encountered that night was capable of approaching silently, disturbing magnetic instruments, producing unfamiliar radio frequencies, and moving in ways no submarine or surface ship could replicate. And that left investigators with one final, uncomfortable question. If the captain had not surrendered, what would have happened next? What troubled American investigators the most was not just what the German crew claimed to have seen, but what they refused to talk about. Several sailors, when asked directly about the moment the fog appeared, would look down, stay silent for long seconds, and then answer with the same phrase, "I did not see enough to speak about it." This was unusual. Sailors normally described everything in detail, especially when it came to enemy contact. But here, the silence itself was a warning. What became clear was that something had happened beneath the surface, something the crew could not rationalize. The chief engineer admitted that he had never seen the submarine behave so strangely. He said the ballast tanks seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as if pressure around the U-boat was shifting rapidly, yet the depth gauge showed they were not moving. He told interrogators, "It felt like the water tightened around us." Another sailor described a sudden drop in temperature inside the boat. The needles on the thermometer fell almost instantly, as though an enormous cold mass had passed nearby. The metal bulkheads began to collect condensation, even though moments earlier everything had been dry. Normally, such rapid temperature changes would require venting, flooding, or a refrigeration malfunction. None of that happened. It was external. The Americans collected every technical detail they could. The U-boat's hull bore no collision marks. There were no dents, no scrapes, no shards of paint or metal from another vessel. Yet several crew members insisted they heard something touch the submarine. The Americans brought in metallurgical experts to inspect microscopic damage patterns. None were consistent with a ship, a whale, or underwater rocks, but they did find something odd. Along one section of the outer hull, the magnetic alignment of the steel had been disrupted in a perfectly straight line, as if a pulse of magnetism had passed across the surface. This detail matched the earlier compass anomalies. The experts could not explain it. The Americans considered the possibility of a massive underwater mine. Certain influence mines used magnetic triggers which could distort nearby fields, but no such mines were recorded in that sector. German captains knew their minefields, and Allied navies kept precise logs. There had been no mines in that location for years. One officer pointed out that the crew claimed the light they saw underwater moved against the current. Their charts showed a southeast current of 2 knots on that night. The glowing object, according to multiple testimonies, moved northwest directly against the flow. One sailor described it quietly, almost whispering. It moved like it was studying us. Even stranger was the reported silence. No hum of engines, no churn of propellers, no cavitation, no vibrations from a mechanical drive. Sailors described it as a presence rather than a machine. The American analysts began to split into 2 groups. One group believed the crew had panicked during a natural phenomenon. The other thought the event was too consistent, too specific, too well corroborated to dismiss. The second group focused on the radio interference. When they replayed the German recording at slow speed, they noticed a pattern. Not speech, not Morse, but rhythmic pulses, equally spaced, almost like a heartbeat. But not human, not marine, and not mechanical. The pattern repeated 3 times, then changed into a faster sequence. One of the analysts who examined it later wrote in a private note, "The signal behaved like an exchange, not a broadcast." The suggestion was troubling. It sounded like the pulses were responding to something. Whatever the source was, it had affected the submarine's instruments, the crew's senses, and the magnetic environment. When the object disappeared, all readings returned to normal. The fog lifted, the compasses stabilized, the temperature rose. The phenomenon had ended as suddenly as it began. The moment it ended, the captain surfaced the U-boat and surrendered. To the Americans, his choice looked irrational. Why surrender just because of a strange encounter? But the crew insisted that the captain had made the only logical decision. They said something had surrounded the submarine. Something had moved beneath them, beside them, above them. Something that behaved like it had intelligence. One crewman said, when the light vanished, he looked at us and said, "Gentlemen, we have survived something we were not meant to see." The Americans never released that quote officially. What made the case even more unusual was that, weeks later, 2 separate Allied ships in the same region reported similar magnetic disturbances. In each case, the compasses spun far enough to alarm the bridge crew. In one report, the sonar operator claimed he detected a large moving mass with no propeller signature. Both incidents were buried in classified files. Years after the war, some American officers admitted privately that the Navy quietly monitored that section of the ocean for decades, hoping to detect whatever had been there that night. Nothing comparable was ever recorded again. Officially, the U-boat surrendered because the war was ending and the crew lost morale. That was the explanation given to the public. Unofficially, the files paint another picture. A veteran intelligence officer wrote in the margin of a classified page, "No known vessel could produce these effects. Recommend indefinite classification." The case was stamped and locked away. The captain never commanded another ship. He returned to civilian life and refused interviews for the rest of his years. In his only surviving letter to a fellow officer, he wrote, "What we saw was not an enemy, but it was not nature either." The Americans asked him one last time, if the object had not appeared, would he have completed his mission? The captain answered, "I would have sunk the convoy and returned home." But when they asked whether he regretted surrendering, he shook his head. His final answer was simple, "You did not see what I saw." What remained most unsettling to the American investigators was how consistent the German testimonies were even when sailors were questioned separately, days apart, under different officers. The details they described match with an almost uncomfortable precision. There were no contradictions on the core events. The fog appearing instantly, the temperature dropping, the radio interference, the magnetic distortions, the movement under the hull, and the glowing object drifting through the water with unnatural control. American intelligence officers were trained to detect lies, exaggerations, or coordinated stories. But in this case, they found none of the usual markers. The crew members often hesitated as if afraid their words would sound insane, but the descriptions themselves remained stable. One American officer noted in his report, "These men do not seem to be hiding the truth. They seem to be hiding their fear." The captain, in particular, showed signs of deep psychological stress. He was a hardened veteran, a man who had survived multiple engagements, depth charges, mechanical failures, and long patrols. Yet when the interrogators asked him to describe the light they saw, he avoided the question entirely. Instead, he said, "I know what ships can do. I know what storms can do." This was neither. When pressed further, he simply closed his eyes and repeated, "I will not speak of that." The Americans assumed he feared admitting weakness, but later, when they examined the submarine's technical logs, they realized something else. Whatever he saw had forced him to make a choice he believed would save his crew's lives. The U-boat had been on a stealth attack mission. They had been tracking a convoy when the strange phenomenon occurred. According to the navigation logs, they were minutes away from preparing a firing solution on Allied ships, but after the encounter, the captain ordered a complete turn away from the convoy. He stopped the attack entirely. This was unheard of. German doctrine was strict. When an enemy convoy was found, the captain was expected to strike unless the submarine was mechanically incapable. The captain, however, seemed to believe that the encounter had changed the situation beyond tactical considerations. One crewman said after the fog lifted, he said we were not to fire. He said we should leave the area immediately. He said we were lucky to be alive. This word, lucky, appeared in multiple testimonies. Not efficient, not strategic, not safe. Lucky, as though survival had been out of their hands. The Americans tried to reconstruct the exact sequence of events using sonar records, log entries, and the crew's statements. What they found was a timeline that made sense only up to the moment the fog appeared. Before that, everything aligned. After that, the data became erratic. The depth readings fluctuated. The internal pressure alarms activated without cause. The radio recorded pulses that did not match any known signal. Then the glowing object appeared and the captain abandoned his mission. The Americans asked the radio operator whether the pulses could have been an Allied code. He said no. They asked if it could have been a German message reflected strangely through the water. Again, no. He described the sound as alive, but not a voice. A naval technician who listened to the recording later wrote a private memo. If it had been a machine, it would have had rhythm. If it had been an animal, it would have had variation. This pattern had both, but not in any combination I recognize. The memo was marked confidential and filed away. One element of the story that was long considered superstition was the claim that the fog appeared instantly, not rolling in gradually, but erupting around the boat in a single moment. American meteorologists dismissed this, saying fog cannot form that quickly. But years later, declassified records from British ships described similar sudden fog banks in the same region. During the same week, the British officers called them walls of vapor. While such formations can occur under specific conditions, the timing matched closely with the German event for investigators to ignore. Another oddity was the faint vibration the crew felt along the hull. Sailors described it as a soft tapping or a brushing movement that shifted from bow to stern. Normally, this would indicate contact with debris, driftwood, or nets, but in each case, sailors insisted the movement was intentional. One said, "Driftwood does not move like a hand." Another said, "Nets do not climb." These statements were dismissed by the Americans as subjective, but the pattern was consistent. The men believed the submarine had been touched. Scientists examined the hull for biological traces or chemical residue, but found nothing. Not even the usual scratches from deep water floating debris. Instead, they found a section of the hull where the steel's internal magnetic alignment had changed, as though exposed to a strong electromagnetic force. The pattern was too straight to be natural. This discovery deeply worried the investigative team. Nothing in known naval warfare, German, American, British, or Soviet, could produce such an effect underwater without physical impact. The leading American analyst wrote in a restricted memo, "Whatever passed near this vessel generated a controlled electromagnetic field, strong enough to disrupt instruments without damaging the hull. If any navy possessed such technology, it would represent a strategic shift." But no navy claimed it. The Americans also reviewed Allied sonar logs from the night of the encounter. One ship reported a large moving contact that appeared and disappeared in under 10 seconds. The operator described it as a shadow without a signature, meaning no propeller cavitation, no engine noise, no identifiable features. It was simply there, and then gone. The Americans compared this sonar event to the U-boat timeline. The two incidents occurred less than 30 minutes apart. This was never included in public reports. The German crew insisted they saw no enemy ship approaching them afterward. They said the ocean returned to silence. The captain made his decision then. He surfaced the submarine, sent a surrender signal, and told his men, "This war is no longer our concern." One sailor, years later, told a researcher he believed something was watching us, something that did not belong to any nation. What makes the story so compelling and so disturbing is that the Americans never concluded the captain was lying, unstable, or delusional. Their final internal summary stated simply, "Motives for surrender remain unexplained. Environmental conditions recorded are inconsistent with known phenomena." The case was classified for decades, and even when it was declassified, key pages were still blacked out.